I'm Carol. Welcome to my channel and welcome to my home. Today I'm going to show you how I made this fade pattern end grain cutting board. I love to make pieces that are functional but also beautiful. Let's go to the shop.
For my cutting boards, I start with rough lumber. This is 8/4 walnut that I had just kind of lying around. I'm going to make a couple of cuts with the walnut, and I'm going to get at least 2 pieces that are about 29 inches. I did some calculations beforehand just to make sure that I'd have enough lumber milled up for the whole project. And 29 inches seems a little arbitrary, but it's actually the perfect length for both my planer and my jointer because I have a little bit of a smaller setup. Once I have my walnut all set up, I'm going to also get some maple. Again, cutting each piece to about 29 inches just for ease of use. Once I'm finished up with my miter saw, I'm going to head to the jointer. This is a little benchtop model from Wahuda. Both of these boards have kind of a big cup, and so I'm going to make sure to put that cup side down. That's going to make things way easier. I'm going to take off a lot less material, although you'll see me kind of struggle here at the beginning. And it gets a little hot in the shop, so I have to take my sweater off. But I'm going to first take this side through the jointer, and then I'm going to take the edge over to the jointer just to get 2 faces that are 90 degrees. Once I'm finished at the joiner, I'm heading to the planer. I have a DeWalt thickness planer, and I just love this little guy. I did have to buy the accessory outfeed tables because it didn't come with that, but that really helps cut down on snipe. Milling up the lumber can take sometimes the whole day, just depending on what else I've got going on. This is a side job for me, so sometimes I just get things done at the end of the day when I get home from work. Wow, the planer made everything look so beautiful. Now I'm headed over to the table saw, and I'm gonna rip the pieces down to some varying thicknesses. For the maple, I'm gonna have some 1.5 inch pieces. Then we'll do some 1 inch pieces of both the maple and the walnut, and then we'll have some 1/2 inch pieces of, again, the maple and the walnut. There's my dog in the background, sniffing around the shop. I love having shop dogs. They make every day super fun. Just raising up the fence a little bit above the board height for safety purposes, and then we'll get started. thought I'd lay out the pattern just to make sure it looks exactly how I want it, and it gives you guys a little bit of a sneak peek. For my first glue up, I like to take my boards back through the planer just to clean up the edges and make sure everything is perfectly flat and smooth. It just makes going and doing your first glue up that much easier. So for the first glue up, we're going to take edge green to edge green, and I tend to be pretty slow about my glue ups. I use Titebond 3, so I have a pretty good amount of open time, but I like to take things pretty slow just to make sure the boards line up, and I am not opposed to getting a little bit dirty, so I tend to use my hands, which sometimes people have rollers, and honestly, it's glue. It doesn't really matter how you get it on there as long as it's an even layer and you've got plenty of it between each piece of the board. I like to leave my board in clamps overnight, and next day I'll come out and clean things up just to get the excess glue off before I kind of take it back through the planer. So after that first glue up and a little bit of cleanup, I'm headed to the planer again. And this time I'm going to use the thickness planer to take everything down all the way to 1 inch. I want both sides of the board to be smooth and flat because this is going to set us up for the next glue up. And now I'm back at the table saw, and I got out my crosscut sled. That does make things a lot easier as you're starting to make the next row of pieces. The first thing I'm going to do is clean up this one edge, and the board at this point is 1 inch thick, but my end board is going to be 1.5 inches. So when I go to cut these pieces, I'm going to make them just over 1.5 inches, probably about 1.6 I think is what I did here. And that will give me a little bit of wiggle room when I have to clean up the face of the board after that second glue up. lining up the pieces again and turning them onto their ends so you can sort of see that pattern. And then I'll flip every other over just so that there's that variation and you can see that fade pattern coming out. And then it's back to glue up. This is one of the more stressful parts of an end grain board because you've done so much work to get to this point that you really don't want to mess up. And I like to, again, sort of really take my time as I'm making this second glue up and go slowly and line each piece up perfectly and line up the ends. And I try to use these clamping cauls every single time, and I always just look like I don't know what I'm doing with my clamps because I am right-handed and I always try to use my left hand to do the clamp. But it does help to use some cauls just to line the board up. So I'll leave the board in clamps overnight again, and I guess I used plenty of glue because it looked like I had a difficult time getting it out of those clamps. And now I'm headed over to my router jig that I use for flattening end grain boards. I'm one of those people that doesn't even want to risk putting an end grain board through my planer, so I do have this router jig that I made. I'm going to use a hot glue gun to glue the flattest side of the board down, and that'll secure it in place while I run the router over it. And then I'm going to use a fairly small flat head router bit, and then I'll run it over the entire face, flip it over, and do it again. Between the flip, I also do a 40 grit sand just to get all the router marks off of it and to make it look as beautiful as possible. And back to the table saw. Again, using my cross-cut sled, I'll clean up the edges and make sure everything is square. And now for the finishing touches. I like this little 1/8 inch round over bit. It has a nice bearing on it that I can just kind of like right on the edge of the board. I'll do each corner first, and then I'll take it across the top and bottom surface of the board. I find that kind of really reduces tear out, but it also makes a nice edge. I start with 80 grit, 120, 180, 220, and then I go all the way up to 320 just to give the board a smooth surface. I mark up my boards with pencil. It just keeps me on track. I tend to check out a little bit when I'm sanding. I think a lot of people hate it, but for me it's just a time to think about the rest of my day. I'll do the front and back surfaces of the board as well as all of the edges with the random orbital sander, and I find this creates a really smooth surface. I raise the grain between each sanding, that way everything comes out much more smooth. And then I moved on to putting the handles on the board. Here I am attaching a jig that I made for my router. I don't have a router table, so a jig is the safest way and most consistent way to put a handle on the board. I like handles. I don't like feet on my board, but I think it depends on what the person you're making the board for likes. So if they like handles or feet or both, then that's what you do. I'll let my board sit up overnight with the mineral oil on it, and then I'll apply a generous helping of wood wax from walrus oil. This really does give the board a nice sheen. Again, I'll let it sit up overnight and then I'll buff the wax off, and this is the end result. I really appreciate you guys joining me. I hope you liked watching it, and I will see you next time in the shop.